Welcome to Middle Fingers Up. I'm your host, Kieran, and today we are talking about what happens when grief meets growth, I guess we can say. There's definitely something sacred about the moments when grief and life meet at the door, and we're going to talk about that meeting. We've all been through it at some point in our life. Maybe it's the loss of a loved one, and then at the same time, someone else enters your world. Maybe it's grieving the life you thought you had while you're trying to live the current one you're in. There's all these sorts of different transitions and points of grief that we experience. And we're going to talk about that today. In fact, this is a topic we talk about quite frequently. And what I love about it is there are so many different ways to pivot, so many different angles, so many different points of view. And so I'm glad to continue having this conversation and bring life to it, because I think we all need to find a way to connect and build this relationship with the sense of grief that we experience in our life. And so I just lost my point there. Okay. So my guest today is Shri, and she has lived this collision of a new beginning while another is going to rest. Over a period of 18 months, she faced the loss of her father, the loss of her sister, and then in the midst of all of this, she became pregnant and gave birth to her daughter. And that season brought her a huge realization that she didn't want to keep on just functioning. She really wanted to figure out what it meant to truly start living. And we're going to unpack that today. She is a grief coach. Shri is the founder of Transforming Through Grief. She works with people who are learning how to move through the process of loss without trying to fix it, without trying to control it, but learning how to build a relationship with it and live alongside it. And so today we're going to continue to unpack what that means, what grief is really asking us when it shows up at that door of ours, how privilege shapes the ability to feel, and then what it takes to break generational conditioning, to become, as Shri said in the consult, and I love, to become the role models that we never had. So here we are welcoming Shri today to talk about grief and everything in between. Hello, welcome. How are you today?
Hi, Kiran. I absolutely loved the synopsis you just gave. It
Oh,
was so complete and so nice. So thank you for putting words into just the journey of grief and journey of life, right? I'm very fortunate that you've created a platform like this, and this is now a time where platform like yours exist to be able to dive deeper into these conversations, which otherwise in our productivity obsessed culture are always very hushed down. Grief and loss, they require spaces like these to be held tenderly and talked about. So thank you
oh,
for that.
yeah. Thank you for that. Is there anything that you'd want to add to the intro that maybe I missed, or that you're proud of that you want to share about who you are?
No, I think you captured it beautifully. I think for me, and somehow the timing of when we are having this conversation is also very sacred to me, because this is the week when all of that journey started. This is the week of my dad's death anniversary. And I was reflecting on my journey, and this is the week, like 18 months from now, I lost my sister. And then, within the next 7 months, I had my daughter, who came into this world and didn't get to meet, the two most important people of my life. And that duality of life and death that I had to hold in my hands kind of taught me a thing or two about, how do we carry opposing truths, which is what human life is about, which is why it's uncomfortable, in fact, to be a human, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we try to live in the face of mortality. So for me, this week holds a lot of sacredness. So I'm glad we're doing this conversation now. It took everything in me to kind of like reinvent myself, like from the career path that I was going into, what I was doing before this, to now what I'm doing. It's a completely different life, but it's still a life that I'm very proud of. And at one point, it felt like, there is no light, which I'm sure a lot of people watching this podcast might feel if they're going through grief, that there is no light at the end of this tunnel. How can there ever be a life that feels as meaningful or as good again, right?
Yeah.
My life absolutely looks different. I grieve the fact that I do not have the same life trajectory that I had then. I don't have the same career. I don't have a lot of pieces of life that I had back then. But I'm still very I'm able to find that contentment in life again. I was able to find joy. So it looks different doesn't mean it's bad, right?
Yeah. So well said. I think let's get into unpacking all of that because you pretty much like set the stage for the conversation that I'm hoping we can have today. You talk about this duality, and I think that you're right, that is life. We have, a good day, and then we have, they say the best of times and the worst of times, and they can happen at the same time. And how do you find yourself, keep yourself, manage the side of you that you lose? All these sorts of things we all experience at some point. And it's so fascinating that on so many levels, though, we've been taught, as you said, to keep it hush, to just let it go and move on. And when we're talking about just specifically even the loss of loved ones, it's so bizarre to me that it's like this love that we had for this person, and we spent all of this time with them in the world, and then when they leave us, that we're just supposed to say okay, see you later and move on. Like, they deserve, in some
Yeah.
weird morbid way of me saying, but they deserve a grieving process. They deserve that. Our relationship with them deserves that. So I think that, having people like you out there that are pushing the envelope and saying, hold on, hold on, hold on, let's work through it, let's work through it, I think that's important because we are also trying to break cycles. Our elders and generations before us, they didn't all get this process, and they carried so much of that grief and that trauma that's been passed down to you and I.
Yeah.
And we're trying to break those cycles with our own children who can live a world of understanding grief, maybe in a bit of a different context. So let's do this. Let's talk a little bit about what moving on is, particularly in the Western world. You're in the US, I'm in Canada, we live in North America. Our roots go back to India. However, the Western world has such a strong influence on how we live, because we have to work, and work has a concept of grief, how we get through day to day, all these sorts of things. So let's start with what we've been taught about grief, the
Mhm.
stages, the timelines, this idea of quote unquote closure.
Yeah.
Where do you think these ideas came from, and what do you think, they miss when we
Yeah.
when we follow them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of different ways you can look at the narrative that society tries to uphold when it comes to grief, right? And there are different inputs you can look at to see how society holds grief in both Western and Eastern cultures, right? There's a lot of cultures in which if we talk about, what are the traditional practices, you can mourn for X number of days. And then if you mourn beyond that, you're doing a disservice to the person that has died. And you're that's not good. They won't be able to rest in peace if you're still sad after X number of days. So they tried to put, you know, a timeline on how you're supposed to feel, for how long you're supposed to feel. And that may not be your lived reality, but there is some fear instilled in you that you're doing some kind of disservice to the very person you love and you're grieving, right?
And
So,
guilt.
and huge guilt, yeah, that
Yeah.
especially when tradition or religion would try to enforce this on you, right? If you look at the Western culture, there are things around these stages of grief that we talk about. You have to go through, you'll be in denial, and that's not the stage you need to stay in. Then you have to move through these 5 stages to get to acceptance. So anytime you're talking about your pain, people be like, oh, but you need to accept that they're no longer here and move on. I'm like, was I given a choice? What does it mean for me to accept that they are gone, right? As a mortal human being, I was not asked. There is no permission involved in this process from me. So acceptance, I have no choice but day one. So what does it mean when I'm sharing my pain, when I'm sharing my lived reality? What does it mean to say you just have to accept, right? And that's again one way of minimizing or dismissing your lived experience. And then come the movies and their portrayal of grief, right? You'll see that people are dressed a certain way for a few number of days, and then once they're actually happy, they're in fields and they're amazing and surrounded by flowers and clouds. Like life doesn't work that way. It is not binary. It's not, your grieving means you have to be sad. If you look happy, it means you've moved on, right? Again, we are trying to impose a binary view of a very complex human emotion here, right? Where we say, if you're sad, okay, you're grieving. If you're surrounded by flowers and clouds, you've moved on, right? And that's what we've seen in the movies growing up. What does grieving look like? We've also seen so many villains painted in this light of grief that when people went through grief, they became this was their villain arc and all of that, There are so many ways we've painted grief and emotion and pain in this society that if you're not happy, and if you don't find joy, you become the villain, right? Because you're now bitter and whatnot. There's no room for those emotions either. um, and finally, there's another one which is in Western culture more so, but I would say it's now pretty much globally prevalent, is you get 3 days of bereavement leave and then you're back to work, right? All of these micro messages all across the society that we are getting. You go to a doctor 6 months later, now in the book of diagnostics, the ICD, it says 6 months, after 6 months, if you're still intensely longing for your loved one after their death, and if you find it hard to be functional, then you have prolonged grief disorder, a
Mhm.
disorder, right? That something is wrong with you. A book of diagnostics will tell you that, which is the Bible of the medical systems, right? And you've been told now that something is wrong with you. How do you then internalize that experience?
Mhm.
Right? So all of those messages, who doesn't intensely long for this person? There is no, subtext around whether you lost the person that you lost was your husband or your child or your friend. No subtext around that. Or no subtext around what does it even mean to be functional. If I'm not able to do my laundry, am I not functional? Who decides what functionality is? If I'm not able to return to work and be at my desk and not at my bathroom floor sobbing and crying, that means I'm not functional. So it's so bizarre that it's something that we've taken something as normal, as complex, as messy, and as human as love and grief, and we have tried to pack it into neat stages, into timelines, into diagnosis, anything that will allow us to avoid actually facing those emotions, actually making room for them.
I think what it does then is it makes people believe that they're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
And maybe you can unpack that a little bit. You probably see that with some of your clients. I would imagine showing up being like, I can't even grieve right. I'm getting that wrong. And
Yeah.
maybe you experience that too. And we're going to talk a little bit later about, during the pregnancy as well. But you had a lot of things on the go for you as well. So I would imagine you've heard it. I know I have. And then your
Yeah.
clients probably too, of like, I'm doing it wrong. So what's the thing to say about that?
Absolutely, because every time that's how we meet pain in this society. That if somebody shares about their pain, we tell them, "Oh, be strong," right? Or if somebody looks outwardly a little put together in a room after a huge loss, we'll be like, "Oh my God, you're so strong," right? All of these are ways for us to tell them, "Keep doing whatever you're doing. That is allowing me to not see that emotion." Right? Or if you're showing that emotion to me, I'll be like, "Be strong." What does that mean? Should I stop crying? Right? So I think it's all packed into making others around you comfortable, not you,
Mm.
right? And that's when people start thinking and internalizing that they're doing it wrong, right? But the rules of the game have been defined by others' comfort, not yours. Societies work in large numbers. If for a society to function, they need you back at your desk, working and productive, right? Society doesn't put just your personal well being at the center of its functioning. right?
Yeah.
So the more time you spend on your knees in heartbreak, the more inconvenient it might be for everybody around you. But that might be the only thing you need to be able to heal, to be
Yeah.
able to let those emotions move through you, to be able to find joy again or meaning again or purpose again in your life. You need to work through those emotions to feel them. So of course in my work I have the one of the biggest part of the work that I do is allowing people to be compassionate to themselves. And I know it sounds like so sad that that's the state of society, right? But having people just be compassionate to what they're experiencing without adding another layer of judgment on top of that. Oh my God, I don't know what's wrong with me. I cry every day. Yes, you lost your child. I understand that. It's understandable that you cry every day, right? I don't know, I'm not able to get things done, or I don't know, I am spending too much time staying distracted and I'm getting things done, but I'm afraid I'm not really facing my grief and I'm doing a disservice. Am I moving on too fast? I had a day where I feel like I've been running away from my grief. Am I not honoring my person? It's like you cannot win. You
Hmm.
cannot win. So the biggest part of this journey is to just allow yourself to be human. Bottom line, you know, we are trying to work through these by packaging it into neat containers, but can you just allow yourself to be human and be compassionate towards yourself? Be patient with your experience. And that's one of the hardest things to do in the way our society has been designed right now. It's
Hmm.
it's really become one of the hardest things to do.
I think we go to this place, like you said, really well, that it becomes about managing everyone else's comfort more than those that may be grieving. And it's so interesting how we lack that compassion for each other because we say things like, well, at least you had time to say goodbye, or we dismiss by thinking we're connecting, but we're making it about ourselves. Like, oh, when I
Yeah.
lost my blah 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 blah, I dealt with it. I remember speaking to, actually, Reshma,
Hmm.
and her and I recorded an episode together. Her husband had taken his life. She has 3 children, and one of her daughters' friend was making sense of her daughter losing her dad, and it's like, yeah, well, I also lost my grandfather, and her daughter really struggled with that
Yeah,
because it's a special relationship between her and her father, and she's not asking someone else to bond with her in the moment. And I think as adults, it's harder, it's easier to accept that with a child, but as adults it's harder to say, whoa, 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 like, I'm being a little protective here for a second because this was my relationship with this person and it's different than your relationship with your person. I
absolutely.
when my husband lost his father, I remember his friend's wife saying, but was he close to his dad?
Yeah.
And and I'm like, man, white people are so interesting because we get made all these kind of comments and made fun of in some way when, as South Asians, we mourn, an uncle's uncle because our family is so big and we are
Yeah.
so connected, right? As our immediate family isn't in the same way as it is in the Western world. And
Yeah.
so I think we bring in our own context, and we really suck sometimes at having a level of self-awareness of, okay, this is how I know it, but that person before me is mourning in the way that they are, and they have
Exactly.
a right to that too.
Yeah, and I would even take it a step further, right? Like, who are we to decide that you can mourn the loss of a father more than a grandfather or anything like that? The
Yeah.
bottom line is we need to stop comparing. This is not a
Yeah.
competition. Anytime somebody's sharing their pain, it's not a competition. It's
Yeah.
not a relatability contest. It's none of that. It's making space for their experience, allowing them to talk about their experience, and you being there to receive it, right? And not make it about yourself. Whether there's a lot of that, the disenfranchised grief is what you're talking about, where were you close? So if I was close or if I was not close, then would it logically make sense to you how much I'm allowed to grieve?
Hmm.
Right? Why that question? Even if I was not talking about my dad or my mom, if I was talking about a friend that died, would you ask me the same question, that what right do I have to grieve them because their family should be more affected? You don't know what went unique fingerprints come together, what relationship they end up sharing, right?
Yeah.
It's their internal shared relationship. And we are nobody to ask the validity of their grief, right? We just, if we are truly being compassionate to another human being's experience, we wouldn't want to make it about ourselves, so that it first has to make logical sense to us that
Yeah.
we are allowed to grieve. It has to make logical sense to us that not enough time has passed and they're still grieving. I had that same experience, right? Somebody 6 months in after losing my dad, they would come to visit, and I was talking to them about how difficult it is that I don't have them there. And this friend of mine, she's like, their family is obviously intact. They ask me, it's been 6 months though, right? Shouldn't you be feeling better by now? And I'm like, in that moment, I just did not know how to react. All I understood was that I'll make sense of this later, whether I'm doing it wrong, I'm not doing it. All it did was shut down that space for me, which means here I can't talk about my experience right now. I have to either do it more correctly before I can share it with them, like figure out if I need to be better first,
But
or
chances are you're never going to go there with like
exactly.
as most of us humans, we'd be like, "Oh, you're someone that clearly I can't talk to about this because
Exactly. And
it's driving you nuts."
that's the problem with a lot of these mantras that the society is relying on in terms of, the grief, compassion, and support, the platitudes. Everything happens for a reason. At least you have another child, or you can get married again. Whatever those silver linings we're trying to show them is to make them feel better, but we fail to acknowledge that the worst for them has already happened, and our
Yeah.
job is to just hold it with them, just
That's
hold it.
asking for a lot.
Yeah.
It's asking, it's, like, it's not from between you and I, but it is for so many
Yeah.
when it's lack of control and you just want to right away make someone feel, because again, you've decided that you need to make them feel better. You need them to, like sometimes people will say to me, "Oh, put it in God's hands." And like, I don't believe in God in that kind of way. And I don't care that you do. That's cool. You do you. But you've decided while I'm sharing my grief with you that somehow God's going to come and take care of me. That's one part of it if I'm a spiritual person. But I also, have to live in the moment right now with this
Right.
feeling and what. So I always think it's interesting. And I think sometimes in our community as well, some people will say you can't talk about it because you're bringing negative energy to
Yeah.
yourself. And
Yeah.
we are storing, like if you think of even epigenetics, which we're going to talk about a little bit later when we talk about during your pregnancy, but when our genes can sort of shift and change when we are holding intergenerational trauma, we're holding grief in us, and then we wonder why it's coming out in this flattened Western way of through anxiety, depression, all these other forms, and we're like, "Oh, I'm fine,"
Yeah.
but then at the same time, I keep crying all the time, and we're so disconnected because ultimately we keep saying just stay positive, and we can trick ourselves as much as we want, but staying positive sometimes has a negative connotation to it in my mind too.
Exactly. And that's the toxic positivity, right? That we're trying to
Yes.
shove down people's throats especially when they're actively experiencing pain,
Yeah.
right? Yes, ultimately everybody wants joy and positivity and meaning, but you got to give that the rite of passage, right? You
But it's
cannot,
also fleeing. Like you can't be
yeah,
positive like and
all the
happy
time.
24, like that's mind-blowing to think that
Yeah,
that we're all striving for one emotion when we have
exactly.
like so many more that we also should be experiencing too.
Exactly. And that goes back to the duality argument that I was making, right? That
Yeah.
that's what is truly needed is to hold the duality of human emotions. People feel guilty for feeling joy when they're grieving, and they also feel guilty for feeling sad for too long. Everything is because there's an added layer of judgment on top of whatever you're feeling. As humans, you are capable of feeling both at the same time. The sadness can coexist with the joy, and none of them cancel the other out.
That's right.
Right?
So well said. Yeah.
So we don't have to chase just being positive and put happiness on this pedestal. In fact, in a lot of ways, when we've faced this darkness, right, this grief, this lack of joy in our life, joy in a lot of ways becomes sacred when it returns, because we understand that, it's possible to hold them both. There's more dimensions to human emotions than just right or wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. What's a myth about grief you wish more people would retire?
I think a lot of people are developing a lot of understanding around the fact that it doesn't exist in stages, but it's still, a lot of people are still holding on to that idea because probably you go to medical institutions or something like that, and the same, institutions that are telling you you're doing it something wrong are trying to measure you by those neat 5 stages. So that's one myth. But the other also is that, again, the thing that we're talking about, I would extend that to say healing in grief does not mean that you're forgetting and then being all joyful again, as much as the society would have you pretend that way. Healing in grief is possible because you're using your heart as the compass to find joy again. You are honoring the ache and the longing. It's here to stay. It's not going to go. If you've spent an entire lifetime loving your dad, if with every single cell of your body you love your child, or you've developed this bond that transcends years with your friends, then you're not going to just forget and move on. And that's a myth. That's a myth. Like, please don't subscribe to the idea that healing in grief means moving on. It means moving forward in a way that deepens your capacity to hold both joys and the love in the now, while honoring your loss and the ache and the longing that exists. And it's
Yeah,
possible to do both. As humans, you have the capacity, you're built to be able to do both.
yeah, I agree. I think, like we said, it's like a relationship. So, like any relationship, we're going to fight. We're going to have a great night. We're going to be silent. We're going to overshare. We're going to do all these kinds of things that I think, if we look at grief in that way, means we can take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And really,
Yeah.
what I hear a lot of you talking about is inviting us to decolonize these mental health frameworks that we've been taken by in the Western world, and we pay all this money for individualized therapy. And I think, okay, on one hand, talk therapy can be helpful. However, I think we have 5 senses for a reason, and using our words, talk is one of them, but we also get to experience grief through sounds and
Absolutely.
smells and all these other things that connect us to the person or the thing
Yeah.
that we no longer have in our life. And sometimes we stop at the talk therapy and it's not for
No.
everyone.
Yeah.
And so I think if you are going to a therapist, there's a lot of push, and I continue to challenge that as someone who worked in mental health too, is finding the right people that are sitting across us that look like us, but also can understand that it's not just cognitive behavioral therapy. It's there's more to a loss in our life than, okay, let's
Exactly.
find a way to get over it and move forward.
Exactly. I love that you brought that up. The fact, and this builds on top of the myth that we were talking about, right? Like honoring this human experience of grief and the dimensions in which it shows up in our life. And talk therapy, again, is just one way. You need safe spaces to talk about your grief. That's bottom line. You do need,
Mhm.
like, suppressing it is not good. But what ends up happening again a lot of the times is, we are trying to somehow get rid of the negative emotions, right? And that's where we are waiting, like something is wrong with us as long as we are feeling some negative emotions, which is of sadness or of fear or whatever. Like, people start developing a fear of health, like health anxiety or anxiety of death, or, like, all of that. But basically, what grief is a mind, body, and spirit experience for you. It's all encompassing, right? And the idea is that the medical institutions today are designed to highly specialize in one area of your body. So there is a doctor for your teeth, there is a doctor for your foot, there is a doctor for your brain, right? And it's great because it helps, gives them efficiency, allows them to be highly specialized with a certain area of your body and treat certain symptoms. But taking an experience like grief and reducing it to symptoms is not the right answer. And that's where a lot of these approaches around talk therapy or a medicine for anxiety, a medicine for sleeping, fail to look at the big picture of what you're experiencing.
Yeah,
And if you do not deepen your capacity, and that's where I tie it to your nervous system and what happens to your nervous system and the way it gets dysregulated after a loss like this, and add to it all these narratives of the society that also make it hard for you to hold that grief, your nervous system gets into this deep state of dysregulation. And no amount of medicines, I'm not saying, you need to suffer continuously, but until and unless you work on that root cause of a dysregulated nervous system and you start using, like you said, these different portals that your body already has and you're born with, talking is just one of them. You can talk about your pain. What are you going to do about it? Right?
that's right. Yeah.
So using the things, the human body, the physical body and the consciousness you were born with, and using it to regulate your nervous system and tend to this mind, body, and spirit experience of grief is how you learn to hold it and honor the duality of emotions in this life and the after.
Well said. I don't have anything to add to that part. I think we're going to break that apart a little bit more, but maybe I can shift for a second.
Mhm.
Like from the whole functioning to living, as you had talked to me about in your consult. So you shared that, there came a point where you didn't want to keep functioning. You wanted to start living. And maybe we can break that apart because I think a lot of people are going to relate to that. What
Yeah.
did functioning look like for you at that time?
Absolutely. So, as you summarized in my story, right, I lost my dad, and then 18 months later, it was very sudden, like to a heart attack. It was a regular day, and he was just not there the next morning, right? Um, and then while my family was still trying to recover from it, I lost my sister, who was a gynecologist in India, to COVID, and she died while being a doctor. And while this pandemic was raging in the society, we didn't know she was walking into the eye of the storm at the time. And then we lost her, and at the time I was 1 month pregnant with my daughter. Um, and all of these events led to me losing all sense of fairness and safety in this universe. Why would this happen? Why did this happen to her when she was trying to do a good thing? She was leading such an impactful life, bringing babies into the world, and she didn't get to meet her own niece, right? I was her baby growing up. She was 10 years elder to me. So she didn't get to meet my daughter. She didn't get to see the version of me as a mother. And all of that broke my sense of safety and fairness in the world. And at that time, like, my career path, as I told you, was set, right? I was a senior leader at Google. I was leading a team of 25 to 30 people. I had gone to a top tech school in India and Stanford, and I was a first generation immigrant to US. And I thought I knew how to do hard things and I knew how to do life transitions, right? Taking your entire life and packing it into a 23 kg luggage and coming, like, I did hard things already, but nothing had prepared me for the difficulty of these losses and for this sense of, this universe, this existence not becoming, not staying a safe place anymore for me, while I'm preparing to bring a new life here. What am I going to tell her, about life, and why live in this suffering filled world, or how to deal with my own grief. One day there was watching my mom sort of, mourn her firstborn while I was giving birth to mine. And I'm like, you don't want to feel like you can't protect your child when you're giving birth to them, right? But I knew that deep in my bones, like, I can't protect her as a mother with all those hormones, and grief was still heavier uh, in giving me that sense that, I got this with my daughter. So everyone kept telling me, and these are the layers, I was struggling with a lot, and everybody kept telling me, give it time. It's normal. What you're feeling is normal. And while that was great, that was very comforting to hear in the early part of my grief, where I was like, okay, yes, it's normal. It's okay to feel these things. But as time was passing, the sorrow was becoming heavier to carry, and the guilt was becoming heavier to carry, because I was moving away from this life that I shared with them. And, the baby was here. I was going to my work. I was going to therapy. I was showing up for my social engagements. I was doing all the right things, and optically, I was trying to live a life that looked very functional, right? And I was getting all those badges of honor, how strong I am, and how people would even go and say, I would not be able to do it. I don't know how you do it. Very comforting. So that's where I really struggled, that optically I was doing everything right. I was functioning and I was showing up for my newborn, and there are things you don't have choices in, right, when it comes to functioning. But no one was teaching me how to live again inside that pain, how to feel joy again, how to feel meaning again. And imagine looking at your newborn and feeling like, should I be protecting myself? Because if I start loving this human as much as I want to, who protects me from grief when it comes from me, right? Again, or finding that, nothing feels meaningful, even with a child in your hand, even with a career you've spent years building. And you look around and you find so much suffering everywhere. And this is the design of the universe. And for me, nobody was teaching me how to live inside those truths, right? And of course, I could keep functioning, but how do I show up and be present for my daughter in the now? She needs me now. She doesn't need me later, right? So to me, it became clear that there is no magical time coming when I'll suddenly be okay. It's
So
not going to happen.
what shifted then for you? When did you realize
So I kept pushing,
survival
right?
isn't enough?
Yeah, so I kept pushing. I was doing all the right things with therapy and with my job and with my daughter and everything, but I burnt out.
Yeah.
That's what ended up happening. I burnt out as a parent, as a professional, and as a human. I'm like, I cannot continue living like this. I cannot continue to suffer every day, And that's when I did something that most people thought was crazy. Some people still think it's crazy when after, I've already built my career again, that I walked away from my
Yeah.
job, right? And a lot of people told me, this is something you built for yourself. And it was one of the dreams of my dad and my family too, right? That the job that I had at the time. But
Did they
to
think you were
me,
having a reaction, like you were so in this grief mode that you weren't thinking straight?
some may have. And, even still, I would say, as a grief coach, a lot of people may think I'm stuck in grief, that I've made it my identity or whatever it may be. But to me, like, it's important, it became that those scales tipped, right? How long will I continue to feed the optics while I suffer internally? And that had to switch for me. And that's when I was like, I was burning out, I was living every day. And one of the deep, unwanted but gifts of grief also is that you start take it gives you a perspective on your own life. I'll die one day, my daughter will be grieving me one day. People that love me will be grieving. Am I happy with the kind of day I am living right now? Right? If this were to be my last day, am I happy with it? I wasn't. Right? The answer for me was no. I was suffering every single day. And nobody was telling me how to find the light again. Right?
Yeah.
And that's when I walked away from my job, despite a lot of people telling me I shouldn't. I went ahead and I searched heaven and earth for a way to feel better, for an answer for me, for answers for me, right? And one of the things that I came across at the time was nervous system regulation. I had always been into a few, practices that our traditional Indian culture goes into, like things like yoga and things like meditation and breathing, but none of it was truly helping me shift the way. But when I started practicing deeper nervous system regulation, I studied the nervous system science, things started shifting for me. It did wonders for me in that moment, in regulating me, in breaking my spirals and interrupting the loops. And then I thought, if it's helping me so much in the moment, what does it look like if I apply these layers to the layers that grief comes with? Right? That the journey of grief sort of wants you to answer. So then I went ahead and got certified as a grief coach by Megan Devine. I absolutely love her work on grief. And for the last 3 years, I've been working as a grief coach in my local hospice, walking thousands of bereaved through the same, nervous system regulation tools that I used for myself, and through the step-by-step process that I came up with that is designed to help you work in a structured, predictable way that takes that tangled emotional mess of grief and turns it into these steps that you can work through and reach certain conclusions for yourself, that
Mhm.
allows you to invite the full spectrum of emotions back into your life again, right? And I've seen these in those last 3 years work over and over again, and I've not looked back since. I've been doing this business. I feel so rewarded in doing this work now. I still hate to, say that all of that suffering was the reason that I needed to find this purpose or anything. I don't think there is any reason to suffering and grief and loss. My sister didn't deserve to die for me to find my purpose or anything. But I do think with the cards that I was dealt, and which a lot of people get dealt for no rhyme or reason, there is suffering in this world. I find it really rewarding to help people find that light again and avoid some of the mistakes that I made on the journey, because I didn't have something at this time that looked like this. You know,
Mm, mm.
uh, so yeah, that's where for me it shifted.
Yeah, that's huge. And if you don't mind, I'd love to pause for a moment at the grieving while pregnant. And I just, I shared that during my first, and I was 7 months pregnant, and my nanny on her last trip to India had suddenly passed.
Mm,
And I remember like the day that she passed, I got the phone call. And I also remember calling in at work that day. And like you, I was in senior management leadership. Like I just connect so much to your story. I really, really valued what I was doing at the time and working in mental health and crisis trauma. And so you think you're in a setting where we get it.
mm,
And it was very interesting because I didn't feel like I wanted to scream, but I didn't think I could because I had this baby inside me. And then my boss is saying, you should just come into work. Like none of your family's here. You're just going to sit around and cry all day. And that won't be good for you. Work is therapeutic. You'll feel more productive. And so I bought into that. And I went and, and everyone's like, oh, it's your grandma. Grandma's die. Like, that's part of
oh my
life,
gosh.
And you're like, oh, okay, you're right. Yeah, I guess. But
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
also, like, go fuck off
Yeah.
because, for many of us South Asians, our grandparents are like our first parents, even before
Yeah.
our parents, right? And so you're just like managing all of this stuff and whatnot. And I remember, then my second time with loss of my other grandparents was when my kids were young. And so I just think as a South Asian woman,
Mm,
we are taught from the minute we're born how to be, who to be with it, where to be. We don't really get to kind of create our own story. It's created for us. And then you become a mother,
mm,
and in the process of growing this baby, you're now going through grief,
yeah.
and that whole, put your oxygen mask on before others is sometimes bullshit because when you're a mom, you
Yeah.
can't you can't think of you
No.
first. You no matter how hard you want to believe it, you think of your baby, whether you're carrying the baby or your baby's born, you thinking of what it is to protect this being. And I'm just like so curious for you in the midst of all of that, while you're dealing with the loss of your father and now your sister, who sounds like is like a mother to you,
Yeah.
and now you're in this early stage of pregnancy. Like, what was the feeling going through in your body, and what did you want to do that you felt like you couldn't do? And it's like the first time you're truly experiencing very early on what it means to be a mother,
Mm.
in your early stages of pregnancy, because I would imagine you're putting the baby before you. And so I'm just curious for you, like, what that was like in your body and how you were trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, I remember very vividly around that time. There was so much of my own guilt, first of all,
Yeah.
that I was feeling as a mother on not being able to be the version of my mother that I always hoped I would be when I get pregnant for the first time in my life. This was not the journey I imagined it would look
Yeah.
like. I mean, I find out I'm pregnant, and a month later, I lose my sister, right? To me, like, I was trying. A lot of people kept, like my relatives back from India and people who, cared about me and the baby and everything would call me and tell me, you shouldn't be depressed right now, or you shouldn't feel so sad right now because it's bad for your baby and you're sharing hormones with her, and you're going to affect how your baby is going to feel, and it creates these changes in them. And I'm like, I was experiencing all of that guilt, which was getting reinforced by people telling me that I should not because I'm harming my child. And to feel that I either have to forget my sister and that ever happened, who was like a mother to me, or I can be a mother. Like it was an either or situation. How do you choose? How do you choose that?
Mm-hmm.
So in my body, like I think while I was pregnant, I was just trying to suppress, right? I was like, I need to be a mother, and then I would cry, and then I would stop myself from crying. And then if I am happy, I would also feel guilty about being happy and about this joy that my sister is not here to experience. So almost every emotion, you're like suppressing it and cutting the oxygen supply to every particular emotion that you're getting. And what you get end of the day then is just again functioning. I was functioning, I was showing up and smiling through the ultrasounds, and I was feeling the joy for a second, and then it would get replaced by guilt or grief, and then I would feel grief, and then I would immediately cut that off too because I don't want to harm my baby, right? So all of these things, and now when I look back, I have so much more compassion for her, that she was carrying something that many people might never even know how to carry, right? And that still came with judgment and the to-dos and shoulds and woulds from other people. What would they do if they were in my position? So I'm like, what a luxury to be able to say that statement, right? Or what I should be doing. They were also in my entire journey when I saw her face, and as I told you, right, as a newborn's mother, but I'm still struggling with all of these big questions around mortality and death and attachment and pain and all of that, right? To look at your child and to feel like you're not being able to be the mother you want to be because you find yourself the guilt and grief pulling you back from how much you want to give, versus feeling like you, when you do feel that moments of joy, as fleeting as they may be, and those feelings of overwhelming happiness, as fleeting as they may be, you feel like, wait a second, does it not matter that your sister just died? And that was horrible, right? And that's a
Yeah.
that's a very, very normal conflict in grief, pregnancy or not, right?
Yeah.
Of course it made it that much more difficult, the fact that I was learning how to be a new mother and I was learning how to be a new griever at the same time. Uh, and the point is that when you're early in any journey, you're still finding out who you are within that journey, right? And you don't have the luxury of not having judgments along the way, because of a lot of high cortisol in your body and
Mm.
being hit by two big events. Your breastfeeding journey gets impacted, right?
Mm-hmm.
You and everybody's like, don't take stress, otherwise you're not able to produce enough milk. And then there is whole judgment around, formula feeding. It's relentless. It's
Yeah.
relentless if you start focusing. And I went through that, through all of those layers for a very long time. And then I understood that I have to take ownership of my own journey. I will never be able to be, I will never be able to grieve right, or I will never be able to mother right
Mm.
if I keep measuring myself against some standards that somebody else is setting who is not in my shoes.
Totally. I always say self awareness is like having a superpower. I think when we can try to be as aware of, okay, this is a rough time for me, and maybe I'm not going to hit all the highlights I'm supposed to for helping my baby. I think the gaining aspect, at least for me, was I also have an opportunity to shift something. Like, yes, I'm stressed. I've experienced a major loss, as you're sharing, like you're mourning one life and then you're nurturing another. But the thing about grief, the more we build this relationship with it, is that okay, where I was maybe 14 years ago when my nanny passed away, and where I am today in my grief journey with the loss of her, I know and understand so much more. So
Exactly.
during that time I can be present with my son and work through some of that. So I think, when we experience trauma in our life, we all do it, but the thing that separates those of us that are impacted by the trauma and, with regression and all, versus those that can thrive, is who's around us to provide safety and community. And so I learned early on when my nanny died, and then when my daddy and dada died, when my kids were little, like I had them view the body. I had them go and be part of a lot of the funeral process that we do, the rituals we do. And I had family member even say like, holy crap, I'm kind of intrigued by what you're doing. My kids are older and they're not part of any of this. And I said, you do you. But I
Yeah.
know for me, I want this to be a parallel journey with my children, and
Yeah.
I can meet them developmentally where they're at. I'm not going to give them more than they can handle. But today, 14 and 12, they remember a lot. They
Yeah.
feel the presence of like, yeah, I was there. They feel honored, and we never stop talking about the loss, because like how
Yeah.
you're experiencing it today is going to be different than tomorrow, but every day there's a part that you kind of release in your journey.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it doesn't go away, and I
It
think
doesn't
I
go
think
away.
we
And
have to
that's
remember that, right?
yeah, the only way is for me, this grief is a life force right now, right? Like for me, it's also it has given a lot of depth to what I do now, right? It has given a lot of I
Yeah.
use that as guiding light. My daughter, for example, same as you are related with that part, right? She has a relationship with her nanu and with her aunt, right? With her masi is what she calls her. And
Yeah.
she came up with on her own, she came up with a name. Like I told her, this is your masi, and she's like Mau. She gave her that name. So I'm like, that relationship is still being nurtured. She has
Yeah.
rituals she'll do. She's almost about to turn 4 right now. Like, but her entire life, she has been building relationships with them as she's been building with the other people that are around and living. She knows that they are part of her world, just in a different way. I tell her a lot of the love that, I say things to you that Mao used to say to me, right? And she knows that that's where I learned that kind of love a lot of times. We have pictures of them that keep appearing, and she asked me about those pictures, and I'm nurturing that relationship for her. And a part of that is her, like she's still just 4, so she doesn't understand the concept completely cognitively of death and everything, right? But she does understand that she hasn't met them, but they are here. They love her, they watch over her, and there is no reason why I need to stop talking about them.
Yeah.
There is absolutely no reason. And as she grows, as her cognition grows, she will understand, and she will hold that same duality, hopefully, that I've learned how to hold. The answers that I've found will be her legacy to carry, right? Like and maybe like she'll have the freedom to find her own answers too.
Totally.
So that's the part to me, that I will never be hush hush about this relationship, and not even death, right?
Yep.
I will never be hush hush about this relationship. I will always keep nurturing. She cuts cakes on their birthdays. She knows that she gets to cut the cake. There is her birthday and Mao's birthday and Nanu's birthday when she gets to cut the cakes. So
Yeah.
she enjoys that aspect, and it's part of the love that she gets.
Totally. And it's you built these rituals that show that okay, grief process can be healthy. And like like my oldest son, he lost his lizard a few years ago, his pet.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, another opportunity, because we're just
Yeah.
scaffolding, you got to experience your great grandparents, now your own love that you're connected to. And, it's sad, obviously, we're all crying and sad, but we have to protect our kids in a way that actually prepares them
Pairs
versus
them,
the
yeah.
opposite of what I think we end up doing because we feel the pain, we don't want them to. So my question is for listeners and viewers, those that maybe are in this space where they feel they've had to delay or carry this grief in a way that they haven't been able to work through and process, and they're holding it all together for their kids, for their families. How can they start naming the grief in the body? What are some somatic ways that they can start to release? And it's never too late to start the
Yeah.
process.
It's never too late, right? I love that you said that because, again, there is no timeline to grief. If you've been holding it all together, if you've been surviving, you've been doing with what you knew how to do, and you've been surviving and you've been putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah.
Grief and loss is so devastating that I can't expect anything more from anybody, right?
Yeah.
And the fact is that when you're ready is when you're ready to do the work. Grief will wait. That's how forgiving she is. She'll wait. We can't ignore for our entire life that grief and death and these things exist, right? And this has happened to you, and there may be a lot of feelings waiting to be felt. But don't judge yourself for not coming to the work sooner, is my first thing, because you were doing whatever it took to stay afloat. And that's fine. You don't hold any judgment about that. If you're ready to step into the work, I would say, like, even giving yourself 10 minutes every day to think about your loss and your grief and how you would want to start holding it differently. Watching within your body when you think about your person that you lost, or anything that you're carrying as emotions around that loss. Maybe you've been suppressing it, but if you give yourself 10 minutes to let yourself feel those emotions, where do they show up in your body? Can you start naming that? Does your chest get heavier? Do you feel knots in your stomach? Do your extremities feel colder? What happens when you think of that? Then you know you're carrying something that is waiting for a release, right? It is not light to carry right now. It doesn't coexist with other emotions for you. It makes you feel a certain way right now. So, how can we make space for that? And again, you don't have to do this alone. Fortunately, we live in a time when there is help around you. You can reach out to a professional that you feel understands what you're going through or you relate with, and who you trust to be able to hold what you're holding tenderly, and then learn the tools. It's never too late to learn the tools, right? And try to put in the work without this expectation of immediate gratification, because this is work of grief, right? This is the work for your mental health. I tell this analogy a lot of times to people around that work with me, right? That you go to a gym and you get the tools, you get the dumbbells, the barbells, the treadmills, and all of that, and then you put in the reps, right? You don't come back all ripped on day one, but you put in the reps, you get the tools, and then you take care of yourself, because you're worth it.
Yeah.
You trust that you can heal. Do the same things with your mental health, with your emotional health, and with grief. Get the tools. You don't have there are tools around you. There is support around you. There are, coaches, therapists, professionals, anybody that you can trust. Go ahead and see anybody else who has built their body in a gym can tell you which tools to use and how to use them,
That's right.
right?
Yep. Yep.
So go to somebody who's done that work, go look for that light, and you don't have to do it alone. That's the beauty of this luxury, which of our times, which I think a lot of our previous generations did not have.
Yeah. And that brings me to the word privilege.
Mhm.
And so you said this really well in our consult. It's very powerful that learning about grief and learning all of this is and was for you also a privilege. Can you expand
Absolutely.
on that?
Absolutely. So I think, to me, a big part of giving up the career that I had built because of the years of conditioning that I went through, right, was that I was associating being successful and being happy and all of those things with this job and with this career, with the optics of how I was operating, right? But when the experience that you're having internally is so disconnected from the optics outside, then you need to understand that something somewhere needs to give, right? And what gives? So even giving up that job at one point, and this was the time when even in tech layoffs were going on, and I still had a job, and I was like, you know, am I going to give up this blessing that I have because I'm not able to hold it and all that? That was one of the things that is part of conditioning for you. And I'm like, but what cost is it coming at? What about my physical health, or what this constant cortisol is doing to me? What about not being able to take care of my emotional health, about my grief? How is that helping the big picture? Right. So for me, like, for a long time, this was coming with the feelings of failure,
Mm.
that quitting a job that is making me stressed, or keep doing the same, things, whether it's therapy or whatever else it was, which optically looked really good and successful and the right things to do, came with those conditioned feelings of failure. That, am I giving up something that I will regret later? But I think understanding and reframing it into a privilege and a choice that I had, that I had the choice to be able to give up a job and to be able to choose something else for myself in that moment, to be able to make a choice that takes better care of my emotional health, of my mental health, is actually wise and not a failure. And if I am feeling good about what I'm doing, I will find a way to thrive again, right? If my internal world is once again aligned with this joy, with meaning, with purpose, I will find a way to thrive again. And that's exactly what ended up happening, right? So to me, I think it is a privilege. A lot of times people think not functioning, not doing the job or the relationship or whatever else that you may think is the thing that you need to keep doing because it's the right thing to do,
Yeah.
is holding you back in a lot of ways from what your quality of life would actually be.
I think of young South Asian women and even men. There's this dialogue of so much guilt when they recognize they have this privilege and this choice, because they're sort of paving this way, breaking these cycles for the first time. These,
Yeah.
first generations of immigrant parents who did the survival thing, and now these young people have the opportunity to feel dissatisfaction at work. They have
Yeah.
the privilege to not get married, to get married, to not, all these sorts of things. And I think sometimes when that choice is available, I'm noticing there's almost like more guilt now,
More guilt.
because, oh my gosh, I'm so guilty that I have the choice to do something different, but I don't know what to do. And so then they kind of feel like they're in a bit of a slump because there's also no direction. And maybe this is where we look in the camera and we do a PSA for these young South Asian women and men who I think we have to teach and say, like, have some grace for yourself because you're
Yeah.
doing something for the first time that people before you, like you said, we are our role models now. We are deciding what that's going to look like when we didn't have that growing up. And again, no shade to our elders. We get why they did what they did.
Yeah.
So if you have something you'd want to say to these young, South Asian men and women that are just in this slump and feeling stuck because they're guilted by the fact that they have choice.
Yeah. I think it is important to recognize that what your parents did was right for them, right? And you have the same luxury. You have the same choices, that you can do what feels right for you rather than following the template that's been handed down, because there is guilt that comes with breaking the template, right?
Yeah.
And I think you have to recognize, you have to take stock of your living situation right now, and you have to look at both your suffering and your blessings to be able to see how can you be resourceful in your lifetime, right? Your resourcefulness does not have to look the same as your parents, but you can be resourceful in a very different way. So for me personally, right, like giving up a job and a career that was not bringing me meaning, even though, like, growing up in a scarcity mindset, because that was the call of the hour, right? That was why it was important to take all those steps to get where I was. It didn't mean that I had to continue honoring that when I had outgrown that mold. When I had the liberty of choice now, which again, your parents' generations have been working hard for you to get that option of choice now. So using it should not come with guilt, it should come with empowerment. You have been building for generations to have this option of choice now. So you getting to exercise it, to you getting to exercise that choice, you getting to honor what makes you happy, fulfilled in this season of life is actually, redemption for a lot of, generations that were working hard to get you to this point. And it
I think
shouldn't
that's
come with guilt.
some of what I hear is this is that guilt and grieving this loss of the conditioning itself. We grew up with all this conditioning in North America. It's very much of the Western white supremacy, the system that has taken all of us that live here, and there's this is the way you assimilate. And if you don't, then you don't really get to make it in the world. And there's all these reasons why we don't. And I think sometimes when you're in the cycle breaking era and you're like, oh my God, I'm so conditioned to think this way, to feel this way, but really I'm not necessarily identifying with it.
Yeah.
There's some grief in that because some people are looking to maybe some friends or siblings that are married that have kids and have these things that we've all been taught we need to feel successful, and those ones that are doing this hard work of breaking through the mold of this conditioning, sometimes they're like, well, what's the point now, because maybe I should have just followed that route. Maybe I should have just done that. And I'd say stay the course, because you're entering such new territory that so many of us didn't know we could when we were trying, we didn't know we could break this mold of being conditioned to be this certain way. If you want to add anything to that.
I think you summed it perfectly, right? Like the fact that everybody doesn't have to fit in the same mold is part of that privilege. And again, let's be more cognizant of not relying on the optics. The only thing you really have control over what is your lived experience. And if that is not aligning with how you want to live your life in the one life you have, for all we know, I think that is where that responsibility should come from. And sure, grieve the fact that you have broken some sort of conditioning, but then also take the time to pat yourself on the back for that, that you
Yeah.
were able to, after grieving that version of you that subscribed to that conditioning, you were able to break free and pave a new path for yourself. There is a lot of self belief that has to be there in that journey too. And you're not going to lose everything. I think the cycle breaking era that you talked about, I do feel like almost every generation has their own battles, right? Has their own generational traumas to break. So, this grief that comes is part of our cycle breaking responsibility now, that we endure some of those feelings that come with it. Will always, like breaking a cycle or generational pattern, will always feel at first like doing something wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? And because it was a pattern to begin with, you have to tolerate that discomfort, and that's part of that responsibility of breaking that generational pattern to set the stage for the next generation, right? If
So
you don't leap higher, then the next generation loses out on those opportunities too.
absolutely, we got to think about how do I leave this place better for others. What would you say to someone who's like beginning to realize, oh, okay, I have privilege here, I have choice to grieve, I have choice to go through this process, but I feel shame about it.
Shame in what way?
Shame in the sense of I have this privilege, I have this opportunity, I have the capacity to go through this grieving process. Maybe it's changing a job, maybe it's doing something different, but I feel really bad about it because the people around me haven't been able to do it, and I don't know how to hold on to this privilege.
Hmm. I think there's a lot of, at least in my context, there's a lot of understanding to be built here, that just because a lot of people have not done it doesn't make it wrong.
Hmm.
And that's where the shame comes from, that you feel like you are taking a leap that too many others you think don't have the privilege to, you don't even know if they have the desire to. everybody will reach different points in their journeys at different times. If you are at a certain point in your journey, your job is to honor that, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they will reach somewhere 10 years down the line. Maybe some people will make the leap because you did,
Yeah.
right? And they will look around and see an outlier and they'll be like, and eventually somebody has to be, a few people have to be the outliers for it to eventually be normalized,
Yeah.
right? So if you are thinking, most people don't understand around me that I need to honor, whether it's your grieving process, that I need to get help with it. There's a lot of taboo associated with mental health, self-care also, where I'm taking this example too, is that investing in my mental health or investing in my self-care is privilege,
Hmm.
or leaving my job when I have, this amazing financial cushion is privilege. I shouldn't be doing it. Nobody's taking these erratic choices. Why am I coddling myself? Whatever,
Exactly. Yeah.
wherever that shame is coming from. I think instead of being, you have a choice here. You can either be that person that reinforces that shame, or you can be that person that releases your own shame and takes the leap so that eventually it gets normalized for others around you too.
Yeah.
When they see your consequences of your choices, of how you are living maybe more fulfilled, hopefully, as a result of just daring to dream, daring to give yourself more compassion, daring to give yourself more support, daring to invest in yourself more, take care of your emotional health, whatever that may be. And if it gives you something that comes out of it, and they see you as a living example of good consequences, then it opens more doors than you may think. And that's what I was saying, that part of tolerating that shame and still doing and following your heart and giving yourself more support, more compassion in whatever it is that is part of your journey, is allowing and normalizing that same thing for others. And in the context of especially grief, I would say, that the society doesn't understand. They give us just 3 days of bereavement leave. My friend doesn't check in on me too often, or they think I should be over it by now. Can you start by giving yourself the same things? Can you start by releasing the shame yourself, and others will follow your lead?
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I think on many levels it's addressing that huge stigma and taboo in our community with what will people think. And we
Mhm.
get so caught in those optics, as you had mentioned earlier. I have to be a mother a certain way, I have to work a certain way, I have to grieve this way, the people are telling me. And then we start to lose parts of ourself, and it makes it a lot more complicated than it needs to be. And sometimes it is like, okay, what is my gut telling me? What are my values? What are my beliefs? Yes, I've been taught this certain set, but what do I truly feel? What works for me, so that I can be true and I can, work through this process. And like you said, maybe bring other people along.
I
And
know.
that takes me to this world of social media. Like, we see so much talk about mental health, about grief and loss. Sometimes I watch these videos and I'm like, I don't understand how it'll be like a doctor that's like crying against a wall because they're like, oh, I lost another patient today. And I'm like, so you set this camera up to record yourself crying? Like, this is all to get followers and viewership. And I think we're sending a very sexy tone to what addressing grief and mental health and all these things. And I think we have to be mindful. We have a responsibility if we're going to be part of the digital world, and how we go ahead and do that. And so
Mhm.
sometimes it just comes out performative, and sometimes it's real. And so what do you think's being missed in some of these conversations on social media, where it's that performative side and people are doing it for the clicks and for all those other reasons, and then you have vulnerable people that think, okay, this is a way to follow, this is a way to, adapt to grief and loss and work on my mental health. Where can people, do you have tips and things that people can look out for, and sort of recognize where it's being performative and not quite supportive and helpful?
Mm. So I think one is always listening to what your a gut is telling you about what you
Mm,
need in your healing journey, right? Do you will be able to see what thoughts make sense to you or not. And what I'm saying is that there may be a different spectrum of thoughts that make sense to one person versus the other, right? But if it feels true for your journey,
Yeah.
you are totally allowed to connect with that part of social media,
Hmm.
right? And when you say there is a two-edged sword there related to, when people are crying on camera. For me, sitting from my bedroom, it is very easy to sit and comment, oh my God, you're doing this for likes and you're doing this for clicks and all of that, right? You're performing, are you recording yourself crying? If somebody's lost a child and they're recording themselves crying, and if they're getting a moment of comfort from sharing those tears with the world, why are tears such a bad thing to share? Why don't we judge them the same way when they are traveling the world with happy pictures?
But then it's like talk about it, because what I'm talking about is like videos where you got like a sexy song and you're like up against a wall. Like I've seen doctors in their uniforms. Oh, I lost another patient today. And the video is someone is recording them
Hmm.
with this music over, and you're like, okay, you're right, totally. Like if you're going to use the camera, then share your vulnerable side. But to me, sometimes that is very performative
Yeah.
because totally that sucks that you
Yeah.
lost a patient, but then like is there a way to connect with us that isn't just showing us this weird video? And who knows, like what I've been watching could be AI related too. Like there's also that piece, is it real or not? So I don't want to
Yeah, which
say that
is
we're looking from our window of judging, because I'm all for it,
yeah,
pride and
yeah.
all that. But I think there's a difference between like we have a responsibility to, like, when we're on social media, about are we being genuine and are we not? And I
Absolutely.
think we all know at the bottom of our heart when we are,
Correct.
and
Correct.
when we're not. And so I just want to be mindful about that, because I definitely am not sitting here saying,
Yeah.
I
No, no,
just
no. I
just
get
seeing
that. And
some of
I
these
love
things
that we
come
can,
across and I'm like, what? I don't know what someone's supposed to get from that. But yeah,
yeah,
sure, if that doctor had a video for 30 seconds to say, holy
yeah,
crap, this is the medical system that we're living in North America,
yeah.
where, like 2 minutes is too late or whatnot. I think, okay, yes, absolutely. But
Yeah. I
but
love
yeah, I
this.
just wanted to
I
be
love
mindful of that too, because I'm like, I'm not trying to shade on that, but I am trying to
absolutely. And I
challenge us
like
as
love
well.
the fact that we are able to sit and have this conversation as two people who
Also that.
also have presence on social media, and that we are able to have and dissect some of these point of views
Yeah.
on these videos, right? I don't think I've watched this particular one that you're talking about, but it does sound like very performative what you're talking about. And for me, like, that's where I think I'd go back to what I was saying in my first point, that listen to your gut.
Yeah.
Is what they're saying, does that make sense to you? Does that sound vulnerable or does that sound performative? Are they trying to normalize, the emotions that you are feeling too, or are they trying to create a spectacle out of
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of judgment needs to come about what do we feel is right for us. And there will all be all these corners of social media that won't be for us.
It's true.
It's a platform of expression, and there'll be all sorts of things there. I think as consumers, we have to be very mindful of what connects to us and where we find its normalization and more compassion for what we are feeling, rather than adding more judgment on top of
Yeah.
our expressions.
Yeah.
Um, Even to the point that you were talking about, right? I totally am with you on that. That the not throwing shade aspect, but that happens, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Social media is still that place where when people, anybody, if they share themselves crying or something like that, and if there's like 90 comments under it, there will be almost 40-50% that would say, oh my God, so cringe that you're videoing yourself crying about it. Like, why don't you do this in private? Or why are you sharing the pictures of, and there's a lot of grief coaches where I also see the same thing happening, where they're sharing their pain, and they're sharing maybe the pictures of the funeral or of the struggles in hospitals and settings like that, and they're like, oh my God, why are you sharing this with all of us? Why some moments should stay private, tears should be private? Why? Right? That if
Yeah.
if somebody's trying to share their story and their vulnerability and normalizing the fact that there is tears, that death doesn't always look pretty, why would we rather put a bow on it?
Well, and it
Uh,
goes back to the beginning of the conversation where, you were sharing about that friend coming over and putting their judgment on what your grief process should look like. And I agree. I think we do have to be mindful about that too. I definitely don't want to sound like I'm contradicting myself
yeah,
now,
no,
but
yeah,
you're right. Like in that, really like do your due diligence, what feels genuine and what is making you feel like you have a relationship with grief versus sort of flattening it. And then there
exactly.
is the other side of when people are vulnerable and sharing aspects of their journey, and some people just aren't ready for that information, and people want social media scrolling to be positive and happy and all those things, and there's also conversation in that because not all that's real too. I could be posting all
Exactly.
these hot pictures all day of my life and who knows
Yeah.
suffering terribly behind the scenes. Like we just don't know what's real, what's not. So we do have to take it all with a grain of salt. But yeah, if someone's being genuine and pouring their heart out, I mean, maybe that won't work for one person, but it will for another. And yeah, we have to be mindful. But I think that's the thing when we get to sit behind our comfort, and just write all these nasty things. We see that a lot with bullying, body
Yeah.
shaming, critiquing women. There's all these sorts of things that you see, and you're like, of course you're going to say that because it's easy for you to type that from
Yeah.
your phone and from your comfort of your house,
Yeah.
and it's impactful in a negative way,
Yeah.
unfortunately, because people see that and take that and then they add to it and whatnot, and so I get there's like a fine line there.
There's a fine line, and I think I would like to reemphasize what you were beginning to say at that point too, is that there is a responsibility that comes with using social media as somebody who's putting content out there. So if there are people who are, putting content out there and listening to this, of course it comes with a sense of responsibility, right?
Yeah.
Having understanding that don't just do it for performative reasons to get the likes and get, as much as we say it, there will be people that do it, right? So there has to be that consumer intuition that comes into play of what I want, because people will be using social media as means to various ends,
Yeah.
right? Some people are there just for the likes and for the reactions and for the cringe content that they put out there, and that
Yeah.
what you were describing sounded like that, with the music and the whole performative dance of I lost a patient, where it's kind of cringe that you would do that,
Yeah.
but we never know what the motivations of somebody is,
True.
and that's true
Yeah.
for any technology. A technology on its own doesn't have an agency or a free will. It's up to people and how they put it to use. So there is a responsibility that comes when you're the one putting content out, that you have to do it responsibly. And as a consumer, again, be responsible on what resonates and what feels credible to you.
Good PSA. Well said. So knowing what you know today about grief, like what would you go back and tell yourself, in that season when you had all that loss and you gave birth? Was there anything that you would say today that maybe you couldn't say to yourself then?
I would ask her to have radical self compassion for herself. I know it's easier said than done when you've been conditioned for years, but have radical self compassion for your journey. There, especially when it comes to grief, there's hardly any other human journey that's more difficult than that. And you don't understand that unless you're the one going through it. Death is one of the finalities of life. It's very normalized, and it's okay to not even protect or prepare, but just normalize it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Normalize those conversations. And I would tell her to find whatever it takes to find really what she did eventually. So no judgments. But I think to release some of that guilt around taking the right choices for her, uh, finding who her people are would be important. There's a lot of people who just can't uh, sustain the season in your life, and that's not on you. That's not, and it's both friends and professionals, I would
Yes.
say,
Yeah.
where you have to find who your people are. You have to find who can hold this with you. Just
Yeah.
because people around you are not able to understand, or they would want you to put up a different performance or a mask or behave differently does not mean you have to subscribe to that. It just means you have to find different people that are willing to hold it with you and honor the season so that in the long term you have a chance at joy, at meaning, at purpose, and all of that. And just suppressing it and functioning through life is not your only choice.
What about for with partners? Like we never talked about with your partner. So you experienced loss on your side
Yeah.
and your partner's experiencing, birth and gaining on his side. So he would have had to balance
Yeah.
how to be there for you while also getting excited. And so can you share
Yeah.
without me prying too much, like, for those that are working, in their own relationship, working through that together, like, what's some advice, some feedback, things that you and your partner learned about each other in that process?
It's a great question. And I think what ended up happening in that first year or two for me is that we just needed a lot of capacity. We just needed a lot of capacity. I was going through something extremely emotionally hard on both ends, grief and childbirth, and, being a new mom. Both of them have very intense emotions to them. And there was also a lot of physically demanding time. It was a very physically demanding time, right? With a newborn, with the lack of sleep, and with you recovering physically and the chores. As first generation immigrants, you don't have a village that it takes to raise a child. You're basically doing it on your own, right? So just the two of us surviving that season when I had every pillar of life as I knew it had fallen apart. And I was stepping into a season of a lot of growth for myself, from being the baby of the house to mothering a baby myself now. Um, so I was going through a lot. I do think I'm very grateful looking back that he took a lot of the physical capacity on himself because he realized that he had physical capacity a lot more than I did in that season, and allowing me the time to heal. And I know a lot of times things like that can come with a lot of, and this was the COVID time as well, right? We were all in a lockdown. And a lot of that responsibility was on my partner at the time to be the emotional support, to be the physical support for the family, not just me, but for the child and for my recovery and, the late nights and every little thing, right? And we just living by ourselves with no help here, the from cooking to cleaning to everything. He took a lot on in terms of physical capacity, but I would also say that at that time, emotionally, I knew between the two of us, we don't have a lot of capacity right now. One advice that I do like to give, and this is true for friendships and for partnership and anything when you're going through a very difficult season of life, what can you do to support that relationship also? When something like this happens, when your entire world is rearranging itself, there is a lot of pressure on this one relationship to keep it all together, to support you in all of your ways. And one person cannot support you in every way possible. That is a recipe for really breaking something that might be good to begin with, right? And yes, grief does become a lot for relationships. Childbirth on its own, any of these events, like loss of a dad, loss of a sister, childbirth, my own grieving brother and grieving mom, any of this can become a lot for a relationship to handle, right? An event on its own, but then put all of them together and it's a pressure cooker. um, I think we both did a lot of work in giving it breathing room, and I think one big part of that was also me getting support elsewhere, whether it was through friends, which again in my case I didn't have a lot of friends my age that understood the depth of what this emotional experience actually meant, both in terms of motherhood and in terms of grief. So there were a lot of secondary losses on top of the loss too, where I lost those friendships. But at that point, like, you don't, yes, they say you need a village, but a village can be really lean too. It can be, an understanding partner who is willing to give you room to figure this out, while showing up in whatever way they can, having a couple of friends who are showing up in any capacity that they can. There were people who were checking on in on me, and or making plans with me, even if they didn't know how to broach the subject of grief. They would be able to just make plans with me and show up, right? Or ask me, we're going on this hike, do you want to come, and be okay with yes or no for an
Mm.
answer, but keep consistently showing up. And then it was up to me to not hold all of these relationships against a perfect benchmark. Not to say, you can't just keep asking me out on trivial plans. You need to be here and listen to my grief too, right?
Okay,
For me,
yeah.
it was a lot of like giving them grace. I couldn't be asking my husband to be there physically and emotionally and go to job and everything. Giving these people grace, and then figuring out, okay, what holes do I have and how do I repair them? And again, as I said, the village can be really lean. I leaned on a professional at the time to give myself that emotional support. And that professional was the entire thread of emotional support for me for a couple of years before I could develop the understanding or depth or tools that I needed. I at least had an ongoing safe space for myself. I recruited support for myself when there wasn't organic support coming my way at that time. And I think that is really important, and that almost acts as taking the pressure off of other relationships.
I don't know if a lot of people would know to do that, because that's also that's like breaking the conditioning mold too of keeping it private, keeping it within. You're so strong, you got this, all those narratives that were thrown at you. What made you decide that you were going to build your own support network and, see a therapist or see some support that way, professional support?
I'm not really exactly sure what, but I do think maybe one of the gifts that I had growing up was a very unwavering sense of self worth. And again, I thank my sister and my family for instilling that value in me. That if, the quality of my life is not where it needs to be, I will probably not settle, which again comes from this sense of self-worth that I am allowed to want more. I'm allowed to deserve more than suffering every single day while putting up a front. And to me, it was channelizing a lot of that grief, to be honest. Like, even telling myself, this is not the kind of life my dad or my sister would want me to live. And using that grief as a life force and a guiding light. Is that, okay, what would they want? If I don't try to get help, if I don't try to change my current experience, what is the alternative? What's the alternative then? Am I okay with that
Mm-hmm.
alternative? And putting those contrasts in front of me, right? Like, if I don't put in the work, if I don't find my healing, what's the alternative? Am I okay with the alternative? I was not. So the answer was very clear that I didn't know if the therapist was the right answer to begin with. If reading these, I think I've read a million books by now, but reading that book was the right answer. But all I was doing was continuing to give myself options, continuing to find that healing, continuing to find what's resonating with me, continuing to invest in myself, you know?
Yeah.
And that made it possible for me to even find that path, continuing to put in boundaries in place where I was not feeling like this interaction is helping me, or this interaction like is keeping me really really suffering right now. Then having gentle but firm boundaries in place, that I am allowed to want a healed happy life for myself than to play small, and just giving myself those options without any guarantees that that option will work, but continuing to not give up.
And I honestly, I want to highlight you say and share that there's a sense of self-worth, because I think sometimes that's just what it is. Like, not only is it accountability to ourselves, but it's also like, I'm worthy of healing. I'm worthy of working through these hardships. I deserve to come around to the other side, wherever, however that might be. And I think that sometimes is a huge barrier for a lot of people
It
um,
is.
in our community, because when you grow up in a survivalist type of home, a lot of that confidence building, self worth, that is missed along the way. And again, obviously not intentionally, but
True,
it
yeah.
matters not when you grow up and become an adult and you're like, what is this gut intuition thing I'm supposed to trust? I don't know. What should I do? So good for
And I
you
think a
to,
lot of times, especially in our culture, like growing up, that self-worth, and I've seen that even here in the Western culture too, a lot of the people that I work with, that you would start attaching your self-worth with the optics of achievement.
yeah, the external measures,
So
100%.
it's
Yeah.
not that it's not even that you're not considering self-worth, or you're not considering yourself worthy, but it's like, what did you attach worth with? You attached your worth with something outside of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to make that disconnection, that was part of my breaking the mold too, right? As I talked about that, where I had to decide that I'm still somebody that needs a lot of, love and thriving, even if even if I'm not doing it in this particular job,
Yeah.
or even if I'm not doing it in this particular career, or I'm not trying to say that that career was the entire reason of the bane
Yeah.
of my existence. It was not. It was a
Yeah.
huge blessing.
Yeah.
But I think to be able to decide that these are the components, whether it's relationships or it's jobs or any toxic environment that's outside of you, that is not helping you nurture you. It's not giving you in this season. It has served its purpose, and now you need something more for yourself. Then being able to release it without feeling like your worth is going out the door with it.
Well said. What would you say you have gained through your grief process? Something grief gave you that nothing else could?
A lot of things. Oh my God, we could spend another whole podcast through it to this, right? I feel I here's a
Done.
few things. Here's a few things I could spend time on. One is I used to feel really bad about the fact that when I looked around, I was one of the more marginal statistics that I would say, where I've lost two people right, one after the other. What are the odds of something like that happening? What are the odds of, usually when you face a big loss, you get a few years to recover, ideally, probabilistically. What are the odds that I would lose my sister right after that, and to a disease like COVID, which nobody had heard of before that? And just probabilistically, I felt like life had been really unfair, and that I had seen this by the time I was like 30. I had already lost so many people, 30, 32. And when I did my work of healing, one of the things I also now am grateful for, I would return any of these gifts for of grief if I could get my people back. So not to glorify, but to say that, I gained a very deepened perspective on what it means to live life in the face of death, what it means to live life in the face of impermanence and changes, what it means that every day that you're living, you're also dying at the same time, right? And to be able to hold those truths at the same time, and how that forced me to redesign my life, how that forced me to kind of look at certain things in a different way. You know, I love this quote: the things that break your heart sometimes end up fixing your vision.
Mhm.
So I think it gave me a lot of deeper perspective in life and how do I want to live. And I feel if I have, again, probabilistically, I've no faith on probability anymore. But I'm like, if I do get to live an average human lifespan, then I have probably more years ahead of me to make something of that time than I would have if the first time I saw grief was when I was 70. I think I have gained that again fixed vision now, with which I can live out the rest of my years with deeper meaning, with a deeper understanding and less on autopilot, where every time I am asking very deep questions on, Is this the life? I'm okay with dying tomorrow because I might as well be dying tomorrow. You know that deep in your bones once you've experienced a loss, especially untimely losses, that nobody is exempt. We might like to pretend that I choose to understand that death is there at every corner, but I choose to believe that I want to still live a very full and fulfilling life until the day comes. So even reaching that understanding, I wouldn't have had that unless I went through this experience. And then also, just what I want to do with my time, I want to help others who are suffering and to be able to say that's my truth right now, right? Right now, I want to pour into others what I've learned. I want to help people find that same light because I have gotten a particular lens that grief gifted me to look at suffering, to understand suffering at a very deep level, and then to decide what now, right?
Mhm.
What now, given that there is suffering in this world? What now?
Honestly, in conversation with you, like I hands down hear that empathy and that lived experience coming together. And again, having a South Asian woman like yourself being able to give back to the community and say, hey, listen, I'm here. I'll hold your hand, I'll work with you, I'll do what you need, and maybe even help you figure out what it is you need. Because I think that sometimes that's half the complexity is I don't even know what I need in this process. You're
Yeah.
numb, you're going through all these sorts of things. And so I think it's wonderful to have people like you out there that are willing to work through such a complex and maybe not fulfilling, part of life, yet it's so necessary. We have
Yeah.
to go through it at some point. And it's so nice and refreshing to hear you share the list of things you've actually gained from something that we hold such a stigma against and
Yeah.
say, oh no no, just like you're more positive, you're more joyful, you have all these things that we're all striving for
Yeah.
by, running around the hill of grief. And you're like, no, I'm going to climb this hill and then
Yeah.
I'm going to come down it however I do, whether I'm rolling, walking, whatever, but I'm going to do it. And I think a lot of us are better for it because you're living and also honoring the thing that so many of us
I
can't make sense of.
really, I'm so touched. I really appreciate you saying it like that, and I do think it comes with a lot of responsibility too. Because when I was going through my journey, I had nobody that looked like me or came from where I come from, doing this work, right?
Yeah.
And understanding those family and culture and those layers that I understood. And a lot of times, no shade here or anything, right? Like. A lot of times I had to explain to professionals why I think the way I think, right? Like, uh, why
Yeah.
would you grieve your siblings so much? Because were you that close? And I'm like, it's
Yeah,
not
there you
even a
go. There's that
thought.
question. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not even a thought. Or like, why would you not put more boundaries? Why would you want like anything around families and stuff like that? We are just also just inherently very very family wise, we're very close with grandparents, with a lot of things, and you can't a big part of me getting support from professionals was sometimes also just explaining a little bit more about where I'm coming from, and then having them see my perspective, which is sometimes it's work, right? It's work on top of grief work,
Yeah. Yeah.
having to explain yourself. So, and that's true. I think I relate with the South Asian part of that and the cultural part of that, which I sometimes found myself explaining. But in every grief story, because every relationship is so unique, a lot of people find themselves explaining things, right, to people who have not untangle those layers themselves or have not
Mhm.
experienced those layers themselves of grief and loss and love and how much it can impact you and permeate every part of your life. So even not having to explain those aspects, whether it's the South Asian aspect or just the experience of grief itself,
As
can
humans.
make
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
make this journey so much lighter, or rather not make it heavier than it needs to be, where you are also doing all the explaining and why your feelings are valid and all of that.
Yeah. I know it's like you're decolonizing the system at the same time of going through your process and cycle breakers, right? I think that's the thing. It's trying to bridge these gaps that we have in our support systems in the world with professionals that are going to help the next person out. And you know, you said this earlier, we want to leave this world a little bit better than we found it. And even in the mental health world, for you to kind of work through that, you're like a research project for some of the therapists and people out there that are like, oh, okay, wait a minute, I as a therapist have a responsibility to say I don't really know everything here that you could be
Exactly.
going through while you're also figuring it out. And I think that's a great therapist who can acknowledge that versus saying, oh yeah, I got all the information, you're all the same, you know, everyone do the
Yeah.
same
Being
strategy here.
open, like it's the same thing whether you're a friend or a professional. Allow them to tell them. Ask, don't tell. Right?
Yeah.
Ask.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, what is something that maybe you've never really said out loud about grief that you've kind of come to think about in this conversation? What would that be? Something that you haven't shared?
The fact is that I've shared so much about grief that there's hardly anything I haven't said out loud. And even with, the Instagram account that I have, that's one of my places of my creative expression of grief too, where if I have a thought, I share it. So I think, I think rather than what maybe I have not said out loud, I would say what things that are not said out loud is that the fact that grief stays with you throughout your life, and it's okay for your grief to stay. That doesn't mean you're doomed to a life sentence. That still means that you're capable of, you have the capacity to hold both grief and life in your hands at the same time. You're capable of doing both, and everybody that has been born in this mortal human body, in this impermanent existence, capable of loving, is capable of doing both. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We are born to love in a world with no guarantees, so we can do both. And it's probably that is part of the design, right? That we are supposed to do both. But it's not an either or choice in life. It never is to anything. You're allowed to want more for yourself. You're allowed to want to heal, to find joy again. You're allowed to want it while grieving. As complex and as big and as impossible as it may sound, you're allowed to want all of it and find your way to it.
Is there anything, Shri, that you wish we talked about in terms of grief or that I asked that maybe I didn't, that or something you want to go back and clarify within this
I do.
conversation today?
I think one thing that I would love to talk about when it comes to grief is that, to anybody listening to this, is be very, very cognizant of having your grief be denormalized in society right now, where they attach some sort of psychological label to you, whether it is, you have depression, or you have anxiety disorder, or you have prolonged grief disorder, which is the one that makes me the maddest,
Mm,
right? Anytime we put ourselves into those boxes, we limit ourselves a lot. And again, grief is something very, very human. Be aware of the fact that you are unfortunately living in a society that is not ready to accept that death is the finality for everybody, and that it's a very normal and natural part of life. Uh, which is why any negativity, anything, you know, related to not living an Instagram highlight reel of your life sounds like a disorder. But
yeah.
it's not. Grief is something that is going to happen to every human being. That does not mean anything that you're experiencing is wrong. Your nervous system needs support, and it's capable of healing itself. It's capable of finding the safety again that this grief and loss has disrupted for you. Your nervous system has stopped feeling safe in this world, and that's a very normal response to loss. That does not mean you need a diagnosis or a label attached to you. That does not mean you have a mental health condition or an illness. going on with you. Because take something universal and attach a label to it and start prescribing medicines on it. Great, you have an amazing business, right?
Yeah,
So
100%. I think we call it the DSM here. You guys call it something different, but it's definitely a money-making book. All these diagnoses are there so that you get the right prescription, the right meds. And again, sometimes you need those things, but that's
yeah,
part of the journey of healing and it's not the be all end all. And unfortunately, the medical world makes it like that's the fix.
that's the whole
And
thing.
that's what I
Yeah.
hear you saying. I don't have to add to it.
Yeah. And I
Um,
think what I was going to say is that these medicines, again, all power to medical science and for coming up with a lot of ways to manage your symptoms, but see it for what it is, right? You can take the edge off, you can manage some debilitating symptoms, but that does not mean that you're still not going through the experience of grief. And it is not as big a part of human journey as birth, right? So you need to give it its due attention, respect, and support that it needs. You need to tend to your nervous system and do the right thing about just tending to your body, your mind, and your spirit as a human being rather than chasing these medical diagnoses or labels or medicines that will keep you kind of sick always,
yeah.
right? Until you start to truly look within.
Yeah. So, middle fingers up. What is one thing that you would want to put your middle fingers up to?
Do I have like do I do it? Do the action as well?
You can do the action or you don't have to.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
So I would like to put my middle finger up to the stay strong slogans in society. I think they're doing way more harm than good right now. I think we need to stop confusing stoicism for strength. Stoicism is a performance. If you're not crying and if you're putting a smile on, if you're showing up for work, for social gatherings, it's stoicism, and you can do it as a performance for people who are not your people, right? But true strength is being able to be a human in this world. True strength, there's only one true strength in this world, which is love and compassion. Compassion for others and compassion for yourself. Despite the impermanence nature of our existence, you choosing to love. What more proof of strength do you need? Right? So the fact that you're born here, you're putting one foot in front of the other, you don't have to judge yourself for how you do it. Don't confuse stoicism for strength. There is stoicism is for others. There's nothing in it for you. What is for you is this one lifetime you've got on this earth and making the most of it. And whatever your journey looks like for you, give yourself the permission to live your life. Don't wait for others' permission for it.
I love that. And you might have already just said that now, but if there was one thing and only one thing people that are here with us in this conversation today leave with on the topic of grief, what do you hope that one thing and only one thing would be?
The one thing and only one thing would be you already have everything it takes to heal, and getting support is not a weakness, it's wisdom. So it's not that you need to find that medicine outside of you or that magical thing outside of you or that particular time that will come outside of you that is holding the key to your healing. You are holding the key to your healing, and you are allowed to ask for support and not do it alone. You're allowed to lean on others. That does not make you weak.
Well said. And lastly, where can people find you if they want to connect with you, start the process of working through their grief, or even just follow you on your socials? You post really good things. You had a carousel about what being stoic is. You do share a lot of good information on there. So where can people find you?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I am active in a lot of social media channels. Instagram to begin with. My handle is at transforming.through.grief. That's my Instagram handle. Transforming Through Grief is also my page on Facebook, if that's where you are, or on Threads. I have a website. Again, easy to remember. It's www.transformingthroughgrief.com. So that's where you can find me. I'm always also in my Instagram DMs. You can reach out to me there or email to me at team@transformingthroughgrief.com. And I'm super good about getting back to you.
That's awesome. Perfect. And like I said, we'll have that in our show notes as well. Okay, so can you believe it? Time flies when you're just having a great conversation. So I just want to thank you. I also want to give a shout out to Mano,
Yeah,
who was
connecting us.
on, right? She's the one that connected us. She was on one of our episodes not too long ago. She's a big believer of our platform. She's a big believer of the work you do. And so I just thought, thank you to her for connecting you and I. I also want to just share a lot of what I'm taking from this conversation today is that grief is not something for us to fix or finish.
Absolutely.
It's something that, we're like we said, we're in a relationship with, and that it lives in our bodies, in our
Yeah.
families, in our cultures. And so when we learn to carry it consciously, it can be honestly like a very humanizing process for
Absolutely.
us where we
Yeah.
learn that compassion, that empathy, and those wonderful traits that you shared with us today. Is there
Yeah.
anything that you want to lastly say or add before we sign off today?
No, just like you said, I think grief is nothing to be fixed or solved. Grief is a recalibration of your human life and your human journey, and you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to have support in that. And also, I just wanted to say a shout out to Manu as well. And I think I want to give you a shout out too. I
Oh,
think you're creating a space for some very, very powerful conversations. I heard the podcast with Manu too, so powerful, such important things where we're going back to some of the roots and what it means to be human and things that we have forgotten about and gotten disconnected from our humanity. You're bringing the focus back there. You're raising your middle finger to a lot of dogmas and a lot of things that keep us stuck and keep us small. So more power to you, and I hope you never stop.
well, I appreciate that we are only possible on MFU with people like you, people like Mano, people like that join us in every conversation. This platform is for us, and so I might have created it, but I need the community to want to believe in it and be part of it. And, I can't have these conversations on my own. So I'm really grateful for people like you that reach out, that tune in, that want to come on, want to get vulnerable. And, we're only just, I always say, like scratching the surface as a community. We're just opening the door to these conversations. So this is the beginning of one, and we love it when people send feedback and tell us what hit well, what didn't hit well either. We learn a lot from that so that we can continue having these conversations, which is the goal. We don't want to stop. We want to keep talking so that we can heal. Otherwise, it stays in, and that's
Yeah,
not great. So thank you for that. That meant a lot. I appreciate that.
absolutely. And then we carry it and we give that as part of legacy to the next generation, right? So
That's
we
right.
must keep doing that.
That's
Yeah.
right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me, Kiran. I really, really appreciate you giving me and sharing your incredible platform with me and with my words. I really appreciate that.